Uh, First, I'm glad you guys really like the emote. So today we're gonna talk about some like common pitfalls learning fighting games. I'm gonna take a big sip and then we'll move we'll move on. My pitfall are very stupid. I know that feeling. Number one common experience learning a second fighting game is, I'm angry. I feel like we could just end it there, and that also works, you know what I mean? Ego. Ego is basically the number one thing when it comes to like struggling to learn new. Yeah, I am serious with this one. No jokes. There are gonna be jokes. If you've done this in the chat, I'd love for you to be honest about it. Your previous experience in a different fighting game does not carry you to success beyond a certain point. I don't want to use the word carry. It does not entitle you to success in a new fighting game. Not just in fighting games, but like, a lot of people tend to do this even in like shooters, right? They're like, I'm a god at Battlefield, and then they go to COD and they get lost and like, this game sucks. And there's a reason for this. There is a very specific reason for this, and it's very much so misunderstood. When you learn a fighting game, you get skills associated with that fighting game. If you've played Guilty Gear your whole life, right? You've spent all your time learning how to do air dash shit and RPS around backdash. You go into Street Fighter, that's probably not going to be as relevant, right? And similarly, if you play Street Fighter, playing grounded and holding your ground and learning how to play low pace kind of footsie may not be as relevant in something like KOF, where it maybe encourages some more aggressive preemptive action. I mean, it's even more, I want to say, asinine to do this when you're going from any 2D game to any 3D game, right? Because it's entirely different. There obviously are some things that carry over. Usually the main thing that carries over is your mental capacity. A lot of people tend to be like, oh, I'm so good at mind games in one game, it should just carry over. And sure, you may be able to understand, you may understand the basic RPS around Tekken. The opponent you play may not. Right? They may just be I'm still learning. They understand a good, maybe their character a bit more. And then you get knowledge checked and you lose and you're pissed. This is usually where a lot of people tend to kind of implode, right? They tend to implode and struggle with learning a new fighting game. You essentially believe that you are better than you truly are, right? And that you can kind of carry over your skills in every way to every fighting game. You could be even more vulnerable to knowledge check than the average player, especially at lower levels. And if you played Tekken, you entirely understand what I mean by this. When you are coming to a fighting game second rather than the first, a lot of people struggle with having fun, or they kind of struggle to get in the groove of things. Whereas sometimes when you're learning a new fighting game, you may just have fun grinding out whatever. Usually, new players in their first fighting game focus on their character. New players in their second fighting game focus on the system. So sometimes this can actually mean that some players are more vulnerable to being knowledge checked because they tend to value the system. And as a result, this is usually where a lot of people get frustrated and just give up, right? They're just fuck this game, I hate it, it's stupid, doo-doo, whatever. No matter how good you are, you can always be knowledge checked. Your inability to recognize this is a flaw. Being knowledge checked is a natural part of learning a fighting game, right? And it can be frustrating because it's oh, I know I'm better than this guy, but they're doing I don't know, what's a good knowledge check in Tekken? Marduk's great. Or I guess Chloe, Chloe as well. King grabs, oh my god, there's a lot. This is why this is boiled in ego. A lot of people take this as this game sucks, when it's actually more of an internal thing. Here's the big takeaways. Here, I'm gonna even make this bold. No more fucking around. I'm gonna make this bold. Your ego carries over and can be a detriment to even having fun in a new fighting game. When you learn a fighting game, you get skills associated with that fighting game. Tell me if this is another situation where I've kind of called you out. Some people focus too much on winning. If your goal is only to win, your fun with the game could literally be entirely dependent on how dominant you are. It's supposed to be fun. You're supposed to have a good time, right? If you lose and you're just I don't like this game, and that's a bad sign. If your goal is only to win, you never have fun with the game if you're losing. I know this is that diamond meme where it's the guy, he walks away with his pickaxe right before he hits the diamonds, but hear me out on this one, okay? I know a ton of people who picked up Strive, they played Soul on Elias, and they just curve stomped everyone. Just everyone. Then when Soul got nerfed, they're like, I'm out of here. They're like, I'm done. I don't know if I like this game anymore. Once again, when you learn a fighting game, you get skills associated with that fighting game, right? Like, you're not going to be able to use, like, 6Ps every single time in other fighting games, like in Strive. You would struggle a lot if you had that habit because, like, in older Guilty Gears, anti-airing was, like, really difficult. It was insanely difficult. If you carry over that skill set of, like, oh, just anti-air every time I see them jump in, then you're gonna get frustrated because you're like, oh, well, what I'm used to is not working. Here's where we're gonna break this down a little bit, okay? I'm a big fan of modern games. I think simplification is a good idea, but the problem with the simplification of fighting games is it also makes a lot of the interactions much more linear. So if you play a game that does not encourage as much linear interaction, then you're gonna struggle way more. You may be like painfully unprepared for anything like that could happen in a new fighting game, right? Like if you go from like Strive to Tekken, you'll probably feel fucking mind blown, right? Like it's just that much different. There are like simple parallels that can help, like obviously like training moding and things like that, they carry over, but everything else, they just not, like at all, right? Like you may be screwed from there on. If you ever feel like you shouldn't be losing to someone in a new fighting game that you have not that much time in, there are skills outside of just direct interactions in fighting games. But you have to understand that when you are learning a fighting game, you are vulnerable to way more things than if you were not used to that fighting game. A lot of people just assume that like their experience is as linear as it kind of, like there's not much more to it. And this is kind of another product of ego that is a little like associated with, like let's say you do well against certain players, you kind of curb stomp them, then like you're getting watched by Bedman or Jacko and you're like, this character is actually broken. And essentially what it is the inability to kind of eliminate your experience from what's really happening, or you just don't know enough, right? And in either case, like one piece of success does not lean into another. You have work to do in almost every field of fighting games. There are situations where you're like, you can kind of get by just naturally by like, playing, but not always. When I usually use the context of ego, it's not healthy. There is a healthy ego, like being confident in yourself. I have mostly a healthy ego. Like, if I lose, I'm confident in myself that like I can say they're the better player, I'll come back stronger next time, right? That's, in my perspective, a healthy ego. But it took me a long time to get to that point. Some people, when they lose, they like destroy themselves. They implode, right? They're like, I'm shit, I can't do anything, whatever. That's like almost like a lacking of ego, but it can also be a problem. The thing about fighting games and life is that you are learning every day. Right? You're progressing, you're learning, whatever. Every day you are, you're learning new talents or getting more comfortable with something or whatever. It is a natural part of life. Failure is not really something to be feared, it's something to be encouraged. Obviously, there's situations where like failure is devastating, right? But in the context of I'd say low risk activities, who the fuck cares? You know what I mean? Like when you lose in fighting games trying to figure something out, all you lose is like the concept that you lost to someone that day. It does not mean that you are incapable of growing. I think usually the things that interrupt people from this path, like from growing, is either they are really too hard on themselves, and instead of like using this energy positively, they kind of like beat themselves up. If you truly think you could have done better, you should understand that channeling that energy into actually learning, or like putting that energy into like, oh, like I lost here, I'll training with this, I'll watch some footage, I'll ask some questions. Like if you don't go through these routines, can you really say you're really doing better? If you're like very competitive, ideally you want that to be something that you used positively, not negatively. There is a fine line between ego and competitiveness, but a lot of the time people that say that they are competitors usually use it as an excuse. To make this example a little better though, like in the context of ego, what essentially people do is that they learn baseball and they go and play soccer, and then it doesn't transfer over, and they're like, this game sucks. A forced change in how you have to approach a game because of a character's strength or how they link up with the system is not a testament to like how bad the game is. Usually, there have been some cursed top tiers in the past, like I don't know, H and K. If you get to like H and K, where like one hit literally kills you in that game, it requires certain skill sets to excel at certain games. Historically, Guilty Gear has always been built around risk-reward, right? Like, always. Like, I know, like, there's a lot of memes about how, like, Strive is. In Xrd, you would play against Millia or Zada with the perspective of, if you got knocked down once, you're gonna lose. So, like, you know, obviously, every fighting game needs you to understand risk-reward. Every single one. Every single one. You may require to do things you may think are scrubby in your main game. Again, one thing that made me struggle personally with KOF, the way that people explain the game to me is that it's much more about being preemptive and controlling space with action, which to me, like, from coming to Guilty Gear, or from Guilty Gear, I'd always think that's fucking crazy. That's fucking insane. There's no way I'll do that. Associating a tactic with scrubby is already a bad sign. KB once said, choosing an option, like, however someone wants to choose an option, like whether you want to do like something super ham or aggressive or like flail on people, or you want to play slow and like kind of react to them, there is no wrong answer, but you have to be willing to accept the outcome of each action. And that's very true. If you refuse to do this, you may just lose by how the system favors a different playstyle. That's actually the pipeline, right? The game requires you to do things that you probably would do. Some games encourage you to be a little more like preemptive, some require you to be more reactive. There is a lot of entitlement in this bubble where people just think like I'm really good at this one game, I should just get it together, which, you know. And of course, like we've talked about before, just because a fighting game requires you to do something outside of your internalized system does not mean it is a bad fighting game. But you do not need an excuse to not play a fighting game. But it's important to give it a very reasonable try. If you're really like genuine about trying a fighting game, you have to understand all of these things, which means it may take a little while. Like, it may take weeks, it may take months. They go through this process of they don't change how they want to play. And it's like, well, like, you know, this is scrubby. I don't want to wake up throw because I'll die or something. You know, like some bullshit like that. They don't want to change how they play, and they're just like, this game sucks. Sometimes you just need time to click with fighting games. Sometimes you need, like, you know, maybe your first try you don't click with it as much. Second try you love it, which was Uni for me. The first time I tried Uni, I was like, I don't really like it as much. I gave it another shot, I loved it. You have to have a conscious attempt at actually trying the fighting game, right? You have to be consciously aware. It's about putting your playstyle through this lens of how the fighting game wants you to play it. System mechanics usually will dictate or encourage you to play in a specific way. And it's up to you to kind of learn that. Enjoy the process. It does not always have to be competitive. You don't have to go into it with the expectation of like, oh, I'm learning this to make $80. You can have the goal of being the best ever, but it should not be something that is attached to like the game before you even play it. But obviously having goals is very important. Ideally, make small goals that are easily felt. Like, let's say you lose to, I don't know, some broken KOF character. Maybe you go in the training mode and you're like, well, I want to see what this character does when they're framed out a little bit. These are goals you can easily feel, right? Like, you'll know, like, well, last time they did like this, it was -10, I didn't press. Then, like, here, I know it's -10, I'll press. Like, these are things you can feel and are reasonable. A lot of people just fail at the process of learning new fighting games from these two sections alone, right? Just this up here. Yeah, overcome your inner gremlin. Some games require you to be the gremlin. Lose yourself to being a gremlin.